So we're excited to talk today about unschooling, and I'll kind of share I'm not necessarily an unschooler. Neither of us are necessarily unschoolers by trade, but we really represent public school, private school, and then over the past year, all of us had to do. My kids were at home for a year, so some level of unschooling. And so I'm excited to talk to Maddie, and I'll actually give you some time to share a little bit more about yourself, but sounds like we have people who are like pretty familiar with the concept of unschooling, but just want to share a few themes. One, that children are really, the idea is that children are wired to learn just naturally. And coming out of the last conversation where he talked about how we're kind of, hardwired for relationships or hardwired for lots of things, that the belief that children are hardwired to learn. When one is interested in something, learning takes place, that learning is a side effect of playing. And I think this is probably on me, the spectrum of that is probably where I would probably, have some different thoughts and ideas. And then also parents are not teachers. So those are kind of some of the 4 themes and principles. Is that Robin? Hi, how are you? So good to see you. Haven't seen Robin in probably how long? Yeah, a long time. And so that's kind of the framing and foundation. And so I've known Maddie for a while, but when I knew her, we weren't necessarily talking about our choices that we were making for her children. And so I was really interested when I first met Maddie to hear about how she was structuring her kind of children's learning. So I'll start by just asking, tell us about your day job, and then tell us about your how you thought about your kids' education, and particularly kind of y'all do a world travel kind of segment. So yeah,
absolutely. So my name is Madeleine Niebauer, and I run a business called vChief. We are a virtual chief of staff service. We match CEOs with fractional chiefs of staff, I created a virtual business on purpose because, as you said, travel is a big part of our lives. And I was actually in Costa Rica with my family for a month when I was sort of coming up with the idea of this company. And it being virtual and flexible was really important to me. Because we had started at that point what we call world schooling our children. So we spend big chunks of the year abroad with our family. We have spent anywhere from 1 month to 6 months at a time traveling in different parts of the world. We spent 6 months on a road trip in South America. We spent 6 months backpacking through Asia. We took an RV to Baja during COVID. And we do it during the school year, largely because we live in Wisconsin and winter's terrible. But one of the reasons that we did this, I mean, obviously, travel is just a passion for me and my husband, but also, it's really important to us to build global citizens and for our children to know both sort of the privilege that they know just in their lives in the U.S. in general, and also just to see and experience how different cultures, operate and what values they bring to the table and things like that.
I'm curious, what was your educational experience like, and how did you even visualize this for your children?
Yeah, it's a good question. I largely went to public schools until high school. I went to a private all-girls school for the last 3 years of high school. I was really fortunate. They were great schools. I appreciated them. I actually thrived in a pretty structured environment. And I think my passion to do something different with our kids didn't evolve out of some negative experience in the public school system. Although interestingly, we've met other world schooling families for whom that was true, who were really true unschoolers who they either personally experienced challenges or just didn't thrive in that kind of environment, or their kids didn't, and they were like, there is a different and a better way for my child, so I'm going to do something different. I think for me, my experience was more colored by my experience in the Peace Corps. So right after college, I was in the Peace Corps in Africa for a couple of years, and that was just a deeply, deeply profound experience on me as a human, and opened my eyes to a lot of things that I wanted to bring to my children too.
So one of the things I've thought a lot about watching, my kids, I'm in Nashville, and so my day job is I founded a company called Possip that helps schools and districts hear from their families, teachers and staff. And so I was kind of wearing 2 hats during the pandemic. One is a mom of 2 kids, one who's 6. Well, I guess he started off at 6 and he's 8 now. And then the other one who's now 11. And so Nashville schools shut down. They were for the year. And so one of the things I was seeing as I'm seeing parents experience as they were watching their kids up close and personal. And then I'm watching schools trying to navigate it. And there's so much I saw. Again, I wasn't an unschooler because of philosophy, literally there was not school. And so we were kind of just figuring out what to do. But I learned so much through that experience that I feel like we've not been able to kind of get back into schools and districts. And so I really want to, I hope from even this conversation that we take away some ideas that we can take back into schools. So given that you kind of do both every year, where you're kind of a little bit of an unschooler and a bit of a, kind of traditional public schooler, one logistical question, how do you do that? What does it require of you with your school?
We are
district?
fortunate that our state has pretty liberal homeschooling laws, and so
You literally go from
we
just
unenroll them.
Wow.
Because otherwise it screws up the district's data. They don't want us to be like absent for 30 days or 6 months or whatever. So we unenroll them and then re-enroll them when we come back. The district really leaves it up to us what we want to do. The teachers have been super supportive and helpful in terms of, like offering whatever we ask of them. The only thing we have kept by and large, the only thing we've kept in a really structured way is their math. So we just don't want them to like miss units and then come back and not know how to do long division or something. So, that is the one area that we've kept pretty structured, and then otherwise we've really tried to use the world around us while we're traveling.
Okay, so then non-logistically, what do you see when you're with your children out kind of in the world that you wish other kids could be experiencing when they're in a traditional kind of school setting?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I think there's a couple of themes. One is really like using the world around you as your classroom, right? So we went to Egypt this past January, and the kids, I mean, what was so compelling about that trip was we were on a trip with other world schooling families, and there were kids who were like really passionate about like Egyptian history. So I'm seeing this like 14-year-old basically like teach my kids about all these just different Egyptian gods, and the kids are getting all so excited about it, right?
Like kids share each other's excitement.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think just that real world, like, here is a thing that I am seeing and is palpable and I'm able to do it. And that is really exciting. And I think the other thing that we've seen just by not having as much structured curriculum during those times is that it is really child-driven learning, right? Mm-hmm. So when we tell our kids, okay, now we want you to go read for an hour, they get to choose what they want to read, right? And so, our kids are really...
Well, y'all carry around a lot of books? How do y'all do that?
No, mostly like e-reader kind of things, right? Or sometimes like we'll find books where we are or whatever. Mm-hmm. But like one of our kids is super passionate about graphic novels, and that was really how he got into reading. He was actually dyslexic and has all sorts of like challenges with reading, and that made us sometimes question, like, is this the right decision, right? Like, are we doing some harm to our child by pulling him out of this structured learning environment where like we know he's going to be getting all this focus? But because he's in charge of what he gets to read and he's super excited about these like graphic novels, he's more inspired and excited to read. And I think finding those ways that you can tap into kids' passion and finding that sort of child-driven learning is one of the really important things I think about unschooling that the formal school district could sort of learn from.
How do you, one of the things you mentioned when we talked about this earlier was that the kid who was really passionate about Egypt had learned that somewhere else, maybe like in school or somewhere else. Was that right? Or that your kids had learned?
Our kids had actually studied Egypt in school before we went. And so we were like going to go to Valley of the Kings, and they were so excited. They were like, I can't believe we're going into King Tut's tomb. Like their heads were going to explode. It was amazing.
So yeah, it makes me wonder like what the role is of kind of the school of introducing concepts and what the opportunities are to go deeper into things. Do you see that often at things that they've studied things in school or when y'all are in places, or is there a disconnect?
I feel
it's
like
just two different experiences.
By and large, it's different experiences. Like once in a while there'll be some things like that, like the Egypt example. But I think because, we're often going to places that they're not learning about, right? And so, like, I think Egypt is a pretty common thing for people to learn about. But like, we traveled all through South America, and they're learning about, seeing more traditionally dressed Bolivians and sort of learning about the indigenous culture and so they might not have learned about it before, but then they get curious, right? And then we're like, one of our assignments often is like, write a blog post about this. So then they have to go like look up information about it on the internet. And then they're like, oh, well, that's super interesting.
So how many hours a day do they do something that's kind of education related, or do you all even think of it like that?
Yeah, so it depends. There have been times where we, like, for one of our longer trips, we actually did like a structured curriculum through the school, and that was like 3 to 4 hours a day where they were actually like sitting down doing lessons. That felt like a lot, honestly, I think, especially for the kids. But I would say on average, probably 2 to 3 hours, they're doing either, some, and it might just be reading, right?
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily super structured. And a lot of times we use the travel windows and other things.
Well, it's interesting. It makes me think about, so quarter 2 of 2020, school shut down, no options. And so I was kind of just like left to my own devices. So we set up a routine, but a lot of it was like, go name our trees outside, like actually give them a name and then like figure out what kind of tree it is and just kind of like random stuff. And then I'm kind of a crazy parent. So I literally gave my kids a map score at the end of the quarter to see what they're, and then, but when my kids, when they went virtual learning, I think they had their scores, even though they were getting more instruction, they were actually, their map scores went down. And I do think like part of it is just like, I think depending on where your kid is, their ability to like kind of go at different levels, and like I would have them do a presentation. We would spin a globe. They would pick a country, like literally, and then like make a presentation for my parents at the end that they would like do. It's all virtual, but it's like and it was a little more structured, than kind of I think full, what I think would be full unschooling. But it did definitely make me see some things in their learning experience at school. I think part of what when you said like the 3 to 4 hours was so much, and I think that's one of my big takeaways from the kind of pandemic is we spend so much time at school doing things like transitions or getting in rows or being quiet and this and that. And what if we just like relax all of this a little bit more for everyone and added some more optionality for kids and for where all the time doesn't have to be like together doing this thing. And so, yeah, I'm curious how you see your kids kind of taking on different things or even just reactions to that.
Yeah, no, I think that's true in a lot of contexts, right? It's like how much like actual productive time can kids have that is like true learning, but also so much of school is so much more than academics, right? Whether you're in traditional school, which our kids love going to school, honestly. Like they made us kind of stop traveling one year. They're like, we just want to go to school.
And what was it they were missing?
They honestly, I think it was a lot of the social interactions and in some ways I think like the structured social interactions, right? So I think like some of that like they really value, right? And then they also value the more freedom, but the social, just the connections with other people, I think.
So funny, my son, he comes home from the first day of school and he's like, I snuck a fart. Like, just like those little things that are like, can only happen when you have an audience and there's like a group of,
and people to play off of,
Yeah.
right? I think it's really important. And I think through our world schooling and our travels, like the times that the kids had the most fun was when they had some social element, right? And maybe that was with other travelers, maybe it was with local kids. And it's amazing to me how quickly kids can like form those connections and build those bonds. But like, I do think that school, like, not only are you like in charge of making sure they're getting their academic goals, but like you're trying to make them good little humans. And
my other thing with unschooling, probably why is I do think there's a lot of like background knowledge and context that really helps. So, like the idea that kids, that parents aren't teachers, which I agree with, but kids are hearing what's happening through their parents. They're hearing vocabulary so that when they read it, they can identify it. From a lens of like equity and opportunity, how do you think about what would be needed so that we could take the best of like the unschooling ideas? I know this is a big question, and like just, but I think also the opportunity for all kids to have like more free learning is also huge. And so we don't want the kids who got like the least exposure to have to just like sit in school and like be sitting in a desk and like have to be like drilled at. So how do you think about
Yeah, I mean, I think it's challenging, right? Because if you look at families who have fewer resources, often those parents are often, working a lot more, right? So how much can they be creating these opportunities for their kids or building that? So I think thinking about like what can schools do to help augment that when the kids are home, whether that's some sort of like home activities or like just building the love or excitement about a given topic or a given thing that the kid can dive into, and then thinking as a teacher or a school administrator, like what can I do to help that kid? Like maybe they don't have a globe at home to do that, but maybe they've shown a passion for this thing. Like what can I do to say like, oh hey, you're super into anime, like, oh, will you draw a character for me at home and bring it in? Or, like just finding ways to like prompt kids to bring out that passion of whatever they're excited about.
Do you think schools have that responsibility or is it up to parents?
I mean, I think it's a lot to ask of schools, right? We already ask so much of teachers, right? And I think, the more that like teachers can encourage parents to do that, but I also just want to acknowledge that like that's hard for parents too, and especially less resourced parents, right? Like sometimes you're just worried about getting food on the table. So I think the more everybody can be thinking about just honestly building that love of learning and getting kids excited about
And
it.
I think the other thing I think about for parents is we work with parents quite a bit is instead of, we often tell people what they have to do, but I think it is sometimes easier to just tell them, share what questions to ask.
Yes.
Because like everybody can ask questions and that's a point of entry and like that gets kids talking. And so I think a lot about that. I want to give folks an opportunity because I don't know if folks came with questions themselves that they had. So I want to open it up in case folks have questions. So you might have a question or yeah.
I'm curious your thoughts on video games and how
Oh, actually, that's good.
It is. She asked me this earlier. It's interesting. I am of two minds, right? Like I have actually seen like the power of some technology for our kids in their learning. Like while we were on this trip, we did a lot of like learning games on their things, right? Like my kids learned a lot of like math facts from Squeebles, right? Or other things, right? And they love playing Prodigy and like there's just a lot of things that like they really get excited about. I also am like, you're on your screens too damn much. And part of that is like, like it's easy. It's easy to let the kids, especially when we're traveling, we have these other things, right? Like to be like, okay, just, we all need a little screen time, right? So, I mean, for us, it's sort of a balance of having limits and things like that. And I do remember like when we were on this road trip in South America, we were like, okay, you have to do like learning games for at least like 2 hours of this 10-hour car ride that we're on or whatever ridiculousness, right? And then let them, have fun with other things. But yeah.
Well, my take has been a little bit informed. So we live in a neighborhood in Nashville that's very kind of like old schools. This didn't happen during the pandemic, before the pandemic, but now my kids, they wanted to play with their friends. They can only play outside. So they got into the habit of going and like running down 2 blocks and knocking on doors to see who wants to come out and play. And so now it's at the point where I'm like, they still want to do the same thing. And I'm like, do they just hate being home? But then I realized the other kids whose family, who come out, I was like, your kids don't have a lot of video games either, do they? And she said, no. So all the other kids who have video games, they're still in their house playing video games. So I think how I would think about it is if you feel like, for me, I want to make sure that the video game access and usage is not so fun that they would choose to do that rather than go outside and play and be social. And so that's kind of where they don't really have access to fun video games. They've got learning games and like Pokemon on the computer and then Prodigy. Like my son's delighted to get to play Prodigy, but like, because I think socially I just start to see kids melt down after like constant exposure to video games. And they don't even realize it, even when they're playing with friends. And so I think I'm probably would skew towards less personally.
Yeah, we've done a really wide variety on our different trips. So we've been doing this for like 8 years, right? And sometimes we've had very, very structured curriculum. The kids were less fans of that. Actually, as parents, we liked it because we knew you were learning like the topics you're supposed to learn. Like, I'm not going to say, let's do a unit on fables, right? Like, it was helpful. But, and then I think math is the one area where we're really pretty structured on curriculum because you can't just come back to regular school, right? And I've seen a really wide variety in the other world schoolers that we know, like radical unschoolers who literally do no curriculum at all. And I'm like, are your children actually learning? Like I am a little more structured than that. I struggle with that. And then we have other like unschooler friends who like their kids really passionate about chess, so they like dive really deep into that. And like you can see there's these brilliant kids who are just taking this thing that they're passionate about and they're building learning around it. So I think to do unschooling in a way that is going to lead to strong academic outcomes for kids, like it's important to be intentional about it is all. Yeah. And I think we're out of time, but if you want to ask another quick one. Oh, great.
We talk to unschoolers all the time. Our basic shtick is, look, it's always a blend. Nobody ever wants to be told entirely what to do. Everybody wants a choice. Nobody should be given entirely their own choice. You should guide them a little bit. Different ages, different kids, you've got to figure it out. It's not unthinkable that you can start 4th grade and kids at about that level. But, this is me as a vendor talking to unschoolers. They don't see a vision. I'm kind of curious if any of that actually has been done by you, giving them that sort of choice.
That's interesting. No, we haven't. We've just sort of said you either have to do this or like I guess we give them more choice in terms of like just what they're going to read about or write about, but we haven't like looked at curriculum and said like which of these are you excited about? I think that's a great idea.
Robin, did you want to say your question real quick too?
I was wondering how old your kids are. You mentioned meeting up with other world schoolers.
Yeah.
Is there some kind of organization that
Yeah. So I have twins who are 11 and a 14-year-old. The biggest place we found world schoolers is there's these Facebook groups with world schoolers. So if you search on Facebook like World Schooling, World School, World Schoolers, there's like 4 or 5 big ones. And we met a woman in Bali who's an Australian woman who now runs World Schooling tours. So she organized this thing in Egypt. So there was like 40 of us on a bus. It was amazing. It's super fun. There's more and more of that because I think that community is really excited to have more community, right? So there's hubs and other things popping up. I think we've got to wrap up.
Yeah, that's cool. Awesome. All right,
We're
thanks,
getting the
y'all.
signals.
Thanks, y'all.